Kiki was one of the sweetest monkeys at the zoo. However, her mood drastically changed when she became pregnant. Her belly kept growing and growing, and it just didn't stop. So, at one point, the zookeeper decided to take her to the vet. The vet performed an ultrasound and immediately turned pale after seeing the most startling results of his life. When veterinarian Charles finally got into the enclosure with the giant gorilla, the animal barely even paid attention to him. It looked weak and seemed completely unable to move from its spot. Charles swallowed his nerves and started to examine the creature. It quickly became clear to him that the speculations had been right. This was not a normal case of any other pregnancy. There was also something else going on with this animal, something that Charles had seen before, but never this extreme. He knew that there was no time to lose if he wanted to give this animal any chance of surviving. He noticed that the animal was getting worse and worse. He had to act right now. He just hoped that he was not too late. But what caused this gorilla to get this big? What did Charles find when examining it, and would be able to save this poor creature? Visitors had been speaking up about their concern for a while now, but it seemed like the employees of the privatized zoo just did not care about their gorilla. The staff completely ignored the comments. They said it was common for gorillas. However, they didn't know that this time they were completely wrong. The poor animal, just like all the other creatures in the zoo, spend their days in a relatively small enclosure, and it was not normal for them to look unmotivated. They are simply not used to anything else. But this was different. The gorilla named Kiki had recently gained an enormous amount of weight in recent times, and now it even seemed like it was not moving around the enclosure at all anymore. All the gorilla did was lie down for whole days, hours at a time. It looked like a classic case of overfeeding to most of the visitors seeing the gorilla, but people who knew a little bit more about the zoo and its owners knew that this was very unlikely to be the case. Strange things do happen often in this zoo. The owners were notorious for cutting costs wherever they could, so the chances of them allowing their employees to waste so much food on an animal that was already this big was very slim. So the chances are that there is something else going on here. There had to be something else wrong here, but most visitors that came to the zoo did not care enough to find it out. And with the employees not caring either, there seemed to be little hope for the gorilla. Until someone showed up. One day, an off-duty police officer took his kids to the zoo as they wanted to see all the animals so bad. He was not a fan of the concept, but for his kids' happiness, he was willing to make an exception. But what he saw horrified him. The cage, small enclosure, poor living conditions, and bad health of some of the animals brought tears to his eyes. And when he saw the gorilla, it pushed him over the edge. He felt that it was his duty to do something about the animal's situation. The next day at work, he immediately opened up an investigation into the zoo to see if he could get it to shut down based on neglect or even animal cruelty. Because it is a big task to investigate a zoo, he asked a colleague to help him along. He had made pictures on his trip that he was going to use as evidence, and at some point, these actually got published. And mainly, the picture of the gorilla got a lot of attention online. The photo of the sad gorilla goes viral on the internet. The photo was accompanied by the story that the animal was seemingly unable to stand up, and it seemed like she was depressive, and she even didn't eat. This raised even more questions online. It was the main topic of discussion in the largest online forums, and all this eventually got the attention of a vet who was located fairly close to the zoo, and he was shocked by the picture of the gorilla. But he was also extremely curious as to what could have caused this unbelievable situation. On the website of the zoo, there was also pictures of all the animal, and they were about a year old. But in those pictures, the gorilla in question was still very much normal looking, so he can only have gotten so fat in the last 12 months. How could such a dramatic increase in size possibly happen in a year's time when apparently the animal had been dramatically overfed? The vet, who was named Charles, decided to call the zoo to get some more info. He was somewhat surprised when the phone was answered by a police officer. Apparently, the case against the zoo had already taken shape very much and the police had closed down the zoo, The investigation was in full swing. They were in the process of collecting evidence to make the case against the owner stronger, and the animal was being taken care of by professionals they employed. But this was a slow process. In addition, the owner of the zoo was just not happy that the entire zoo had to close. There were a lot of animals that needed medical help, and all of them needed to be transferred to a new home, as this zoo was not capable of housing any of them humanly. Here is where Charles saw an opportunity to get a closer look at the gorilla. As a self-employed vet himself, he offered to come to help out at the zoo with the animals, an offer which the police gladly accepted as they could use all the help they could get. They could put the man's years of experience to good use. Charles travelled to the zoo that very same afternoon, and although he was intent on helping as many animals as possible, he had to admit that his first focus was very much on the gorilla. He thought there was no time to waste. When he arrived, he got briefed by the vet actually leading the efforts to help the animals. He seemed really optimistic, but when Charles asked him about the gorilla, his expression changed. He began to look a little hopeless. They had not yet gotten around to checking the animal out, and in all honesty, it also was not high on their list of priorities. They actually already kind of gave up on the animal after seeing what state it was in. When Charles finally got to examine the gorilla, he figured out that it had actually swallowed a heap of plastic which was making it sick and causing it to swell up. Luckily, removing it was a quick fix for the problem, and after a month of recovery, the animal was back to full health. Charles was in a pickle. Although he anticipated the situation, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He had been looking forward to getting closer to the infamous gorilla. But that would not be possible, at least not yet. The attending vet had other plans. According to the vet, the zoo had been incredibly lax in their treatment of all the animals. There were far too many animals that would need to have priority care before he would attend to the gorilla. This had not been part of Charles's plan, but it was clear he didn't have much of a choice in the matter. As a vet himself, he had an ethical responsibility to all the animals. Charles nodded and turned to assist the main vet in any way that he could. He was assigned to perform health checks on all the animals that needed to be transported out that day. This would end up taking about 2 hours of his time. Finally, the priority animals had been sent out to their new homes, and the last of the remaining animals would be leaving in the following days. Charles was finally free to do what he had set his mind on. Waving goodbye to the volunteers and staff as they headed home for the day, Charles smiled to himself. It was finally time. Charles was very excited, but he couldn't shake off the growing feeling of fear. Regardless of how weak the animal was, it was still a wild animal, and a large predator at that. He knew he would have to be as patient and calm as possible to avoid agitating the gorilla. This was a level of risk that none of the other staff or volunteers were willing to take on. Everyone else had resigned themselves to the death of the gorilla. Charles was more than aware that he would indeed be treating the gorilla alone. But luckily, Charles was. A very admirable and selfless decision to make Charles walked slowly, not wanting to alert the gorilla. However, the gorilla ignored Charles's entire presence in the cage. This caused him to wonder if the animal had passed away already, but seconds later, he watched as the gorilla took a deep breath. Charles sighed in relief. Now he would have to get closer. Approaching the gorilla slowly, Charles made slow but visible movements to calm the gorilla. But nothing seemed to faze the animal. The animal turned a lazy eye to Charles, but did nothing. It was clear that his presence had been acknowledged, but the gorilla didn't seem interested in it either. Charles counted himself lucky. Although he wasn't certain if the gorilla was genial or too weak to attack, the animal's resigned state allowed him to inspect it closely. He began his assessment by taking quick scans and feels of the gorilla, concentrating on the bloated stomach. Its size was far more daunting in person. The swelling was so large that it was preventing Charles from making a sound judgment of the animal's vitals, which were hidden behind the swelling. So far, the only thing he could confirm was that the swelling was not entirely due to fatty tissue, meaning it was likely something external causing the bloating. Even then, it was far more excessive than he had ever seen. Whatever was causing the bloating had clearly been piling up for far longer than he had initially suspected. This made the situation more dire than Charles was comfortable with. He would need to do some further digging. It didn't take long. While he was feeling for unusual pressure in the gorilla, Charles quickly noted something that alarmed him slightly. But it had nothing to do with pressure. Instead, it was what Charles observed in his surroundings. Or rather, what he did not see that left the young vet puzzled. The areas below and around the gorilla were clean, suspiciously so for an animal that had been unable to move in months. It was now clear to Charles that the problem was a digestive issue, or rather the inability to defecate. Was something blocking the intestine? There was only one way to find out: surgery. Charles wasn't fazed by the results. Plus, all the tools he would need for the surgery were in his medical mobile for such emergencies. There was only one hiccup. Sedating an animal the size of a gorilla would require a large dosage which could prove fatal to an animal in such a weakened state, especially when he would be performing the risk operation alone. Charles debated the idea for a bit longer until a thought struck him. The gorilla's condition would only worsen, which meant every moment that passed made the life risk higher. If he wanted that the gorilla would survive the risky operation, he would need to act immediately because every second mattered. Charles knew what he had to do. Wasting no time, he quickly injected the large gorilla with the sedative. It only took a couple minutes before the effects of the drug kicked in and the gorilla was fast asleep, but most importantly, immobile. Once the gorilla's breathing had stabilized, Charles carefully made the first incision. Although it had been a while since his days in veterinary school, Charles was a little familiar with the anatomy of a gorilla. It also helped that he had done a quick catch-up study on the specific breed of a gorilla the night before. Charles knew exactly what he needed to do to get to the blockage and ease the pain. It was a nerve-wracking procedure, but Charles moved with precision. It didn't take long before he made his way to the base of what was likely causing the problem, the stomach lining that led to the gorilla's bowels. There he found massive swelling. The animal's stomach had stretched and was saturated with unreleased feces. The expanded stomach was causing an outside bloating and creating hard spots across the animal's bowels. Charles could see that there was something beyond the culminated waste that was causing the blockage in the first place. Charles wagered that the gorilla had likely eaten something that it shouldn't have. This was not too uncommon with unsupervised cages. Charles was careful to massage the area as he cut the bowel lining. His goal was to get whatever was blocking the bowel opening, but was startled when an influx of waste began to seep out from the cut he had made. It was clear that the clogged feces was spilling out from the new opening to ease the tension in the gorilla bowels. Charles was attentive and slow in his movement. He made sure that the entire valve was cleared out before he focused on the object that was creating the block in the gorilla's gut. Once it was clear, Charles nodded. He wasn't surprised by the discovery he made. This was an expected but troubling outcome. In fact, he understood how the gorilla would have come to eat the object. It was a ball of plastic trays, the kind of trays that animal food was stored in. It was clear the zoo employees had not done their due diligence when feeding the gorilla and did not remove the transparent lining. Now that he was certain of the cause, Charles did not hesitate any further. He emptied out the plastic, careful not to damage the thin lining. With meticulous speed, he stitched up the gorilla and supplied it with enough liquid to keep it hydrated. Now, they would have to hope for a safe recovery. The next day, Charles arrived a little anxious to check on his four-legged patient. He made his way quickly to the gorilla enclave and was shocked to see that the animal was already further along in recovery than he had anticipated. It was a medical miracle. Charles sighed in relief. The primary vet explained that they were all shocked by the animal's recovery and thanked Charles for his help rescuing the gorilla. Charles smiled broadly. He was glad the gorilla was recovering and decided to personally nurse it while they waited for the eventual transport to the zoo that would be its new home.